The Timeshift.
Rest in peace, small triangle robot. We will always remember you. What did you think about this week's episode of Doctor Who? Leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you shortly, either directly in the comments themselves or towards the end of a future video. Whilst you're there, be sure to like, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTube stuff that YouTube wants you to do, because YouTube is an increasingly scary place for small content creators. Support your local small content creator today, it will do them a power of good. Now on to the review. This week we get a more historically focused episode with War of the Sontarans, an episode which, shock horror, actually shows the Sontarans being a threat, for what feels like only the second time in their history in the modern run of Doctor Who. We'll discuss them in a little bit more detail just shortly. If we're going to discuss the headline positives, as it were, for the episode and my takeaways from it, I have to say that I feel that this week's episode was a hell of a lot more focused than last week's episode. It just felt more like it should be, more like a real episode of Doctor Who, with a clear through line of events without anything feeling too stoppy-starty, for want of a better phrase. There were no moments where we were just suddenly cut into another character that would have no impact upon the core story. Everyone that was here because they had something to do, even if some of those things to do is stuff to do with the wider story, which we'll discuss in greater detail in just a few moments. I was admittedly worried towards the start of this episode that we're going to get more like we had last week, with just, again, random cuts to different characters in different time periods, but thankfully that wasn't the case, and things started to tie together a lot better as the episode itself went along. As far as pacing is concerned, I have to say that the pacing was solid. It wasn't the greatest, it certainly wasn't the worst, it just did what it needed to do. There was never a moment where it felt like things were moving too quickly, and there certainly wasn't any moments where it felt like anything was dragging. There were no conversations around kitchen tables this week, thank God. Jodie Whittaker is actually getting time to be the Doctor, which, regardless of what you think of her performance, the fact she's actually getting time to be the Doctor and have the screen time to do it is certainly a tick in the great boxes of things that are good about this episode. I have to say that I did like the set design for many of the environments, the Time Planet in particular, but I'll admit this is a different strokes for different folks thing. I'm just glad that Doctor Who is actually having a chance to have sci-fi elements and sci-fi environments that actually look science fictionally, and not just some run-down estate in Wales pretending to be London. That is a whole of discussion for a whole of a time. And I think that as a general entity, this episode was better in being able to balance the wider story stuff with the core story stuff without either element feeling like it was running over the other. But again, I'll discuss the wider story arc stuff in just a few months' time. And for now, we'll talk about the actual core of the episode itself, the War of the Sontarans stuff. I have to say that I do feel that I am happy that cliffhangers are back in the show. Sure, that statement should feel like it's something that comes to the end of this review, but I just have to say, I love that cliffhangers are back in the programme now. When the Chibnall and Whittaker era started, it was right after the Twitch streams Doctor Who stuff had just ended. You know, the marathon had only ended a few days or a couple of weeks before it, so when it came to actually seeing the woman who fell to Earth, the dawning of a new era of Doctor Who, it felt more like classic Doctor Who for me, because I was just in that mindset and it had that crucial element in it. It made it feel like it was more of a continuation of the classic run of Doctor Who, far more so than the other incarnations that we've had of Doctor Who in the modern run of it. Like, when the Russell T Davies era started, it started like a couple hours after a big Doctor Who marathon had finished, and just the culture shock between what Doctor Who was going to be and what Doctor Who had been was something that admittedly it took a while for 15-year-old me to really get my head around. And the reintroduction of this element, I don't want to big it up, but the reintroduction of the cliffhangers, in addition to the pre-title stuff, which was a very Russell T Davies era aspect of it, as well as elements of humour and character that we got from the Stephen Moffat era, made this episode feel like this great melting pot of all the great things that we've had in the modern run of Doctor Who up until this moment. It tips its cap to all the great things we've had in the past, while still looking forward to the future as to what things we could do to make the show better going forward. But that again is a whole of discussion for a whole of a time. Whilst this I do feel is a bit of a bone of contention for some people, I have to say I did like the fact the characters were separated from one another, as you actually gave each character some screen time to actually be themselves and for us to get a better feeling for who they are as characters, as well as give the performers time to actually do their bit. I will admit I do feel that Yaz wasn't really utilised all that well, but that is a statement that you feel that you could say for just about any single episode that she's ever been in. She just kind of feels like she's a little bit too there. For a character that has "What Would the Doctor Do" written on her palm, it does feel like she's just kind of a passive observer. When I saw the "What Would the Doctor Who" thing written on her palm, and when she was separated from the Doctor, I felt that it would lead to a situation where she effectively fills the role of the Doctor as best as she can do. She's a lot more of a proactive and explorative element that's trying to save the day as best as she can do, but without cacking it up in the same way as Clara Oswald did. But she doesn't. She just sits in a really cool environment, not doing much until the Crystal Face people come along, and then that's kind of it for her. I feel that the Sontaran scheme was just so gonzo and crazy. It was kind of fantastic in a way. This great cosmic time-space breaking FU to humanity was just so stupid but brilliant at the same time. It was kind of schlocky. Like, they wanted to do this big, possibly time-breaking war against humanity out of a sense of honour. A sense of honour and a sense of revenge, and an expedition which ultimately could see them getting wiped out of time and space, because it feels like this big time-space continuum breaking thing, but they do it anyway because that's just how bloody-minded they are, which is what makes them an interesting threat in the episode. They're bound by just this twisted sense of honour and warrior code that they're willing to destroy and break time. I mean, sure, maybe the flux would have helped protect them from any nasty repercussions, but still, it's a ballsy thing for them to try and do. If we are to start to just transition into the negatives for me about the core story, I feel that for better or for worse, this was a very typical and very traditional modern historical episode of Doctor Who. The sci-fi element in this episode was far stronger and far more of a main focus. There was far of a less of an emphasis and a focus on the quote-unquote edutainment aspect, and regrettably our lead historical figure was just kind of there. The fact that they are this big historical figure just felt like a bit of a coincidence, like, oh, they just so happened to stumble upon this character and just there they are, which feels so untypical, like previous Chibnall era historical episodes, where almost the entirety of the episode and its events revolves around them. They just felt so unimportant to the meat of the episode that they could literally have been replaced with a fictional character for all it was worth. I mean, seriously, the tone of this episode was, oh, hey, here's Mrs. Secor, this awesome and little discussed figure in human history, but we're just going to deliver exposition to her and have her sit on a rock for the majority of the episode. Laters! Which I really dislike because she's a great character. She's well performed, but she just kind of sits there. This great, formidable character, and she's just boiled down to just being a secretary, a lookout, and I don't like that. I get why that is the case, though, from the sheer mechanical point of the episode itself and the events at hand, but it feels so weird getting so little time to actually get a chance to get to know them and to understand why they are so historically significant, but that's just the way that it is, sadly. And to be honest, this isn't just a problem with modern Doctor Who's historical episodes. This is that echoes all the way back into the classical run. Like, almost as soon as this is decided, right, let's sod this edutainment lark and just do a science fiction program, it felt like from that moment on, any kind of historical Doctor Who episode was just historically incidentally, where any historical figures or time periods that they came across just felt like set dressing, and it's something that I always disliked about the classic run, and something that I really disliked about the modern run. At least in the modern run, they tried to tie it back to the historical character a little bit more, even if at times it feels like a fairly limp, crowd-pleasing kind of a way, a pop history kind of way, but sadly that is what it is. It feels like, from my point of view, sadly, Doctor Who either has historical episodes where the historical element is the main focus and the sci-fi element feels tacked on, which is what we got with the Demons in the Punjab and the Rosa Parks episode, or we get episodes where the historical element feels tacked on, and sadly that is the weakest element of this episode as a whole for me. In addition to that, and tangentially connected to that, we have the evil military guy who has this weird heel turn towards the end of the episode for really no good reason. Like, his character isn't really built up enough to make it feel like it's justified, which again lends itself to the fact the historical element just isn't explored enough to really justify it. And even just then, even beyond that, how did the Doctor not notice this was happening? That's a lot of gunpowder. Sure, they might not have put it underneath every single ship, but still! The Doctor must have noticed the baggage train behind her, all these boxes and bags and all goodness knows what else. She must have known they were up to something, right? But of course, at the end of the day, he's just your typical quote-unquote evil military Doctor Who character, so it kind of doesn't matter. And the fact that given this whole time-space willy-billy wobbly thing that's going on, these Sontarans might not even technically exist in this time period anyway, so he's not really killed anybody. He just set off a bunch of gunpowder, which, once the timelines are restored, probably would just be back in their quarters anyway, so it really doesn't matter. Which feels like a sad thing to say, but that's just the way it is, it feels. I feel that the larger story arc stuff with Swarm, Azure, and this new dark seed looking guy in the background is unfolding in a very steady and curious way. It is still rather early at this point to really get into the nitty-gritty of it, but I like what I'm seeing so far. It's getting the little brain cells ticking along in my mind, it's getting the cogs whirring, and starting to make me speculate about fan theory stuff in a way that I haven't really done really all that much in the entire run of the Chibnall era. I mean, let us address the elephant in the room here. At the end of the day, this is probably going to tie back to the Timeless Child stuff. Whether you like it or not, that's what we're going to end up resolving by the time this whole story arc is done and dusted. There is a part of me, though, that feels that the Timeless Child possibly isn't what we think it is. Because the way that Swarm, Azure, and the rest of them talk, it makes it feel as though this isn't their first rodeo, if you get what I mean. It feels like they've done this stuff before, or they've at least tried to do this before. So it may well be that in previous loops of this, the Doctor has been able to reset everything, but in the process of it accidentally sent themselves back in time so that they can try and stop it again, which has resulted in them becoming the Timeless Child. So, in a way, the Doctor still is the Doctor that we know and love. It just happens that they've accidentally bungled stuff that's actually made them inadvertently this big important figure in time history. And maybe when they solve all of this, it'll effectively retcon all that and just make them the Doctor that we've always known them to be. But we'll soon see. It just kind of bends my head trying to figure all this stuff because I'm having to think fourth dimensionally. And being a mere mortal is something I really struggle with. I have to say that I think that the idea that time is this destructive force as depicted in this episode is interesting. This big, nasty, timey-wimey, possibly what the flux itself is just time running riot, time in its purest form, in its most chaotic way. And if it's not brought under heel by these mystic Adola Link people, then it's just going to make time break down. It's going to make everything happen simultaneously and non-linearly, but not in the fun way that we saw during the 11th Doctor's run, where, you know, you had Winston Churchill going up against Hannibal from Carthage. You know, it's simultaneously where everything is happening at the same time constantly. Just this constant loop of creation and entropy, never, with nothing ever existing long enough to actually be something, but it lasting long enough to be destroyed, and it just happening constantly with every passing microsecond. It's just this horrific idea that everything just exists to just break down, but never really exists, but never really is broken down. Just this chaotic mass. It's just really creepy when you start to think about it. Maybe this is the flux, and this is what they're trying to hold back, and with the weakness of what's going on, that's what's causing it to break out. I really don't know. It's up in the air. So much is in the air. The stuff with this division is up in the air. Are they going to become a main central point to the episode or not? Some people with better eyesight than me are suggesting that it might be the case with next week's episode, which it could be. I mean, next week we get this Cybermen back by the looks of things. How that will relate to what the Master was doing towards the end of last season, I really don't know. If we are going to start to get into the more colder aspects of it, of this episode rather, it's the fact that with this episode, we are now a third of the way through this year's season. A third of the way through it. This year's season is only 6 episodes long. Sure, there will be specials going into next year, and it will be all resolved by, I think, this point next year, but Still, we're not really going to have a full run of Doctor Who this year, which I've said in the past I really don't like. I understand that things have been difficult, I understand that things aren't really convenient for so many people, but if this was always going to be the case, we're always going to have things diminished. I would rather have all 8 or 9 episodes, however long it's going to be, in one continuous season, rather than here's your 6, see you in Easter for when we get the next part, and then see you in November to when we get the part after that. But that, again, that is a whole other discussion for a whole other time. What did you think about this week's episode of Doctor Who? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comment section down below, and I will get back to you shortly. Whilst you're there, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and do all that YouTubey stuff. I will have to say that whilst I am a little bit of a down mood at the moment where I just think about how far into this year's season we are, I'm still cautiously optimistic for what we're going to see in the future, because thus far, nothing bad has happened. But to be fair though, I had this exact same feeling when the Chibnall era started, and I have this horrible feeling that when we get into next week's, or maybe the episode after that, is that when the wheels are going to start falling off this thing. I'm in this really two-minded place when it comes to the Chibnall era at the moment. And it's something I just want to discuss at another point when I've had more time to think about it. But thank you all for listening. See you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!